So you have saved and invested $1 million or more in your TSP. And the question now is, how much can you actually spend in retirement from that amount of money? We all love saving and investing, but how much can you actually spend and withdraw every single year throughout your entire retirement without worrying about running out? Because any old dog can definitely pull money out of TSP, but it's a different matter altogether to make sure it lasts your entire retirement and actually keeps up with inflation and prices over time. So today we're going to talk about what things you need to know how you can actually enjoy your money, pull down out of your TSP, take withdrawals, spend from it, while you never have to worry about running out. Now, let me start with a simple way to approach this. There's more complicated ways, which I'll certainly address later, but let's first start with a simple approach. One simple approach that is very, very common, and you've probably already heard about, is what they call the 4% rule. And this is how it works in a nutshell. You take however much you have saved, multiply it by 4%, and that's what you take out year one. So if you have $1 million, well, it's pretty simple. That is $40,000. Year one, you take out $40,000. Now, the rule has a couple other things. It says, look, that's where you start. This is year one. But what about year two? Do you take out another $40,000? Well, year two, you would actually take out $40,000 plus whatever inflation was. So let's say now it's $41,000. And year three, same thing. You take $41,000, increase by whatever inflation was. So now let's say it's $43,000, etc. You would keep going throughout retirement, increasing. So basically, throughout retirement, you'd spend $40,000 a year, increased by inflation over time. That's what the 4% rule is all about. And what the 4% rule says is, look, if you follow this rule, if you follow the 4% rule when it comes to withdrawal, the odds of you running out over the course of a normal length retirement, 30, 35-year retirement or less, the odds of you running out are exceptionally low. And they tested this through some of the worst times to retire, whether it's the Great Depression, 2008, etc. Now, let me actually show you an example of how this works in real life, or has worked in real life. So here is a chart that shows how the 4% rule has actually worked in real life over the last 20, 25 years or so. So this chart shows us, okay, what happened if you retired at the end of the last century, December 1999, with $500,000? That is the question. And depending on how much you withdraw, how long your money or how much money you'd have today. So basically, as we look down here, the different colors on the chart represent different withdrawal rates. Here in purple represents what if you took out 8% per year. Instead of doing the 4% rule like we just talked about, what about 8%? Well, in that case, so they would have ran out of money within about 12 years of retirement. Now, what about 7%? Well, maybe you got 15 years before you ran out of money. If you go 6%, maybe you got about 18 years, and then you would, of course, run out of money. 5%, you would have about half your money still left after 20, 22 years, roughly. And last but not least, if you followed the 4% rule, then even 20 plus years later, you would still have what you started with, plus maybe a little bit. Now, as you see, as this chart goes up and down, there's certainly been fluctuations along the way, especially here in 2008, where there, of course, there's a big market downturn. But again, this is not to show you exactly what the next 25 years are going to hold, because we don't know. This is to show you, hey, if you did follow the 4% rule, at least what has that done over the last 20, 25 years? Now, keep in mind, how you invest your TSP does matter when it comes to how long your money is going to last. For example, if you follow this 4% rule here, as this chart shows, however, you don't invest your money in a way that makes sense, then you'll have problems as well. For example, this chart assumes that someone invests 50-50. And what that means is 50% of their money in conservative investments and 50% of their money in more aggressive investments. So if we're talking TSP language, conservative investments are things like the G fund or the F fund. The more aggressive side is the C, S, and I, all right? Now, it doesn't make sense for every retiree to invest 50-50. This is just what this chart assumed. But for example, if you were to be heavier in some of the conservative funds where your money just didn't get very much growth over time, in the short term, you'd have less volatility. But long term, while taking those withdrawals, money can be depleted a lot quicker. And if you're too heavy on the aggressive side, for example, if you didn't really have any safer investments, you were too aggressive, then here in 2008, you would have actually had a bigger drop because more of your money was exposed to the market. So there's no perfect allocation. There's just finding. I've got whole other videos, by the way, if you want to know more about how to invest during your retirement. There's different approaches, and I've got whole videos talking about that. But this video is more about how much you can actually spend, which is, of course, a different topic. I just had to mention, though, that how you invest will impact how much you can spend over time. Now, one thing to keep in mind that this chart definitely does not take into account is that in real life, it really isn't going to happen where someone is going to see that their money is depleting really fast and keep spending down, right? In real life, we're humans, right? We can see what's happening and then adjust as we go. This chart, of course, doesn't take in any of that into account. And so in real life, if you were to spend, let's say, more than 4% per year and be willing to adjust later based on how things do, then of course that could work as well. And that's what some people do. There's one strategy called guardrails. Okay, you might have heard of that as well. Guardrails, where basically you spend more. You start spending more than the 4% per year, sometimes 5% or in that ballpark. Okay. You start by spending more, but you're willing to adjust down how much you're spending based on how your investments do. Because look, if your investments do incredibly well, then you can spend a lot more than 4% per year. For example, you might have heard that the stock market, like the C fund, for example, over the last 100 years has average growth of 10% per year. So if legitimately your money grew by 10% per year every year in retirement, then yes, you can spend 10% per year and never run out of money, never even touch your principal. But in real life, things are up and down. That is why something like the 4% rule is so powerful to say, look, here's a withdrawal rate that if you stick to this plan, the odds of you running out of money are very, very slim. So in a nutshell, these are the different approaches people take when thinking about how much they want to spend. Is they can stick to some basic rule like the 4% rule. And honestly, for planning purposes, it's a good place to start just to get a sense of, okay, how much can I reasonably produce for myself over time? But we understand, in me as a financial planner, I know real life gets messy. Some years, maybe you need more, so you got to take out more. Some years you may need less, so you take out less. I understand life gets messy, so you may have to have some wiggle room in your plan. But if over time, as we see here in the chart, if over time your plan relies on you spending significantly more than 4%, then you potentially are in a really scary position depending on how the market does over time. So basically, for you to get the most out of your money, number one, you've got to understand how much over time can you reasonably pull out, whether it's starting at 4% or a little bit more if you're willing to be flexible. And you got to make sure you invest your money in a way that you actually get some growth over time to sustain those withdrawals over the course of an entire retirement, so that hopefully down the road, you still have buying power. You still have money down the road deep into retirement when you need it. Now, of course, last but not least, everyone's retirement is different lengths. If you retire at 80 years old, then how much you can spend will probably be different than someone retiring at 50. That can be taken into account as well. All right. So these are all the factors and things I would consider when trying to decide how much you can pull out of your money without worry about running out. Again, a 4% rule is a good place to start, at least for planning purposes. But of course, real life does get messy. But you just want to make sure, at least on paper, your plan looks good to go. So I hope that's helpful, and I'll see you guys in the next video.